This year will make 12 years since the last time a core game in this series has primarily used sprites instead of the 3D models we'd get after with Pokemon X and Y. I want to say, man, I can't believe it's been that long, but honestly, it really does feel like it's been over a decade. Like, we've had the core games in 3D forever at this point. It's pretty common to say that the pre-3D games are special these days. And yeah, they are. But I do think it's also just the right time for a lot of people to say that, whether it be hindsight or nostalgia. I do think they're more aesthetically pleasing. Though, I'm not sure if any single game has ever gotten it entirely perfect. And hell, I'm starting to see people talk about how X and Y were special these days too. Not the X and Y anime. People always like that. But the games. People definitely weren't saying that 8 years ago. So I do think when people start bringing this up, there is a combination of certain generations of fans getting older, nostalgia, and hindsight. That being said, I think the preference many have for the sprites in these older games is more than just nostalgia. For the most part, it gave each generation a more distinct personality on a visual level, and the Pokemon sprites expressed themselves differently from game to game. This was all partly them working with hardware limitations from generation to generation, but there is definitely a little more to it than that as well, especially when looking at some of the visual design choices for GSC. That's why today, I want to take a look at what I think are the best sprites for each generation. That is, going up to Generation 5, of course. But, as usual, Miss Magius, Pokemon Crystal Clear, and Wind Waker HD Let's Play. Links will be in the description below. Starting with Gen 1, it's, known for some interesting sprite work. But it's definitely not all bad. Some of the off-model sprites are actually kind of artistically interesting. Execute's middle egg almost looks like it's meant to be interpreted in a more stylistic way than a literal one in red and blue, for example. With the middle egg having a very up-close, intimidating look that actually kind of works for a psychic type at the time. It's still pretty weird though. RB Executor is another one I'll list here, as it really succeeds in making it look ridiculously creepy. Going back a little further, Pokemon Red and Green's Tauros sprite is actually pretty perfect. It's kind of like its yellow sprite, but a lot less generic looking. Red and Green's Gengar sprite is, well, I can't call it good, I think. But I'll give it a shout out just for being very funny looking. He looks less scary and more like a class bully. This Gengar just wants to take your lunch money. Haunters, honestly, isn't bad all things considered either. Back to Red and Blue, there are a few that make some very peculiar poses. Tentacruel over here is judging you with his arms crossed, and Amistar is having a great time. Then there's Golbat and its iconic tongue that went mostly missing after these games. I think lastly, I'll give Pokemon in Yellow in general a shout out. The improvement in the quality of sprites compared to the versions that came before it is definitely commendable. That's not to say all of them are outright better, but it does a good job of establishing an accurate representation of what these creatures are supposed to look like more consistently throughout the roster. Gen 2 is where we see the biggest upgrade in overall sprites quality in the series' history. I would argue that GSC has the best set of sprites in the series, but that's very subjective, of course. But there's no denying that the colors, shapes, and shading are all very unique in these games, and has inspired a lot of fan-made sprite work. So, where do I even start here? There's no way I can name every great sprite here. So, which are the standouts? Hitmonlee in Pokemon Gold has a pretty good pose. I like that it's a sprite that chooses not to emphasize its lower body strength by just having it kick toward the screen. All of the Muk sprites are also really good, which leads me into a point about the sprites in this generation. The colors are really saturated on these Pokemon, and it's especially noticeable on anything in the pink to purple range. This is because they were taking into account how they would look on the dim original Game Boy Color screen. Execute, for example, is extremely pink, but on the GBC screen, it's a softer, more natural pink. Of course, if you're playing on the later Game Boy Advance SP model with a strong backlight or an emulator, you'll just get the saturated colors, which admittedly still look really cool and unique on a lot of Pokemon in these color ranges. It's just a few of them that look a bit silly, like Mr. Mime being way too pink all over. But this brings me to a Pokemon that I think looks better with the game's naturally saturated tone, Gengar. Some people say that Gen 2 Gengar, especially in Crystal, is quite possibly the coolest looking Pokemon sprite of them all. And with that strong purple color as an outline, it makes the darker colors that make up the majority of its body stick out in a way that's very menacing. I'd put Haunter in the same category of cool with Gengar, with its sprite also making good use of this. And of course, you shouldn't be surprised to know, I'm a fan of Silver and Crystal's Umbreon too. I do think Red Eyes is ultimately the way to go for its design, but it's fun to appreciate this yellow-eyed version too, or the blue-eyed one if you're using a shiny. Steelix is another contender for potentially the best sprite in Gen 2. This goes for any version of it you're playing. The shading, the color, just perfect. And it's very fitting as it's basically a major boss encounter in Johto. Jasmine Steelix being notoriously high leveled and therefore no joke. So this sprite is a great representation of this beast. Now, in a future video, I'll be able to talk about the visuals of Gen 2 a bit more. So as much as I love the visuals of these, I don't want to stay on it for too long right now. So I'll leave my impressions on one more, Mewtwo. Mostly because of how it lights up from bottom to top, and its pose actually works pretty well. Definitely better than its Silver Sprite's pose. Other sprites I think are pretty good in this gen are Charizard, Totodile, Silver Feraligatr, Silver Pidgeotto, Blastoise, and Crystal's animations for the Cyndaquil line. When we entered the RSE era, sprites became more consistently on model, which was generally still a good thing. But I do have to admit, it is around when aesthetic choices between generations started to feel more similar as a result to this, as color palettes and such became less limited, and they generally had these designs pretty figured out ahead of time by then. So, the best of the sprites here? Well, again, they're all very on model here, so it's going to become increasingly difficult to pick the standouts. But how about Hariyama's? That's pretty much the perfect pose to show off its design, and it's what a lot of fans think of when they think of this Pokemon. Also, maybe now would be a good time to mention before I forget, but not to. Just not to. In every game this thing is in, it's funny to look at. Every sprite in every game it's in seems to give someone a different reaction. Is it funny? Cute? Are you a little creeped out? I have to admire the effect this design seems to have on people. I kinda like it personally. Its Gen 3 sprite is no different in this regard, and is kind of the standard I think. Speaking of previous gen monsters, how about Charizard in Fire Red and Leaf Green? It's pretty similar to Ruby and Sapphire, but it looks just slightly better here. And I think it might actually be the best Charizard sprite overall. It just hits right. Also helps that this is the best generation for Charizard until Generation 6. For another Pokemon actually introduced in Gen 3, Ludicolo in Emerald is one of the few that actually has any personality in its animation, bouncing around in a way that depicts the personality of this thing perfectly. Unfortunately, most of the animations after Crystal are pretty bland. Usually just a quick bounce or something with only a few exceptions. Black and White would change this completely later, but we're not quite there yet. At the very least, even though its animation isn't as cool as before, Mewtwo's Gen 3 sprite is pretty sick just for its art and pose choice. It's actually a little more intimidating than the Crystal sprite. Honestly, despite being a bit basic in approach, I really do like a lot of the Emerald sprites. When Gen 3 was new, these felt so fresh after the more experimental sprites that came before the Game Boy Advance era. There are still a few color choices that are a little strange, like Dratini being purple for some reason, but the overall look of everyone is how they would look all the time from here on out, minus a few very subtle art changes that would happen every now and then. Maybe if we do a worst sprites video, I'll have more interesting things to say for Gen 3. Because despite being solid across the board, there are a few that probably didn't pan out the way they wanted them to. Other sprites I like from this gen are Emerald Ivysaur, Emerald Dragonite, Emerald Lapras, Grovyle, Torkoal, and Wailord. When it comes to Gen 4, you're probably expecting me to say more of the same, since it doesn't differentiate itself as much as going from Gen 2 to 3. But there actually is something on a broader scale to say about DPP's sprite work. And to put it simply, most of them are just sleeker. The series was 10 years old by this point, and now they really had a grasp on how they wanted these Pokemon to look. While most of them were already good in RSC, I noted that there may have been a few exceptions. Here's what I consider to be an example: Charmeleon. So in Gen 3, especially in Ruby and Sapphire, Charmeleon looks kind of weird. I'm not sure if it qualifies as off-model, but it's kind of ugly. Now, Charmeleon is supposed to be the most aggressive and sometimes even barbaric of its evolution line. We get a look at that in the anime, and all of its Pokedex entries often state this. So this look isn't out of place with its personality, but the way its face looks in this sprite is kind of off. And I think I know the reason why. It's not based on the more modern designs that were coming out at the time. It's based on an older design for some reason. Look at Charmeleon in this art from the red and blue era. That looks closer to this sprite than any of the art that would come after it, including the anime and even its precious sprites from Pokemon Yellow and Silver. Suddenly, in DPP, it looks more like it should look. A sleeker, more familiar design. Even the shade of red it has feels more right. One that I feel suits the aggressive, boiling, hot-blooded nature of the creature really well. Yeah, the 3D models that would come later are more desaturated, but the home image for Charmeleon is very much like this Gen 4 sprite. And I think Gen 4 probably has the best sprites for Charmeleon. That analysis I gave kind of sums up Gen 4 sprites. They have little improvements, polish, and aesthetic changes that are enough to differentiate themselves from what come before and after. It's hard to say if they're the best or not. As for other sprites, I like Kabutop's poses. Diamond and Pearl Snorlax is like the most adorable Snorlax ever. Mareep 2 is unbearably cute. Blastoise in DPP has a really great stance, and Raichu is also pretty cute. And as for Pokemon introduced in this generation that stood out, well, Giratina is actually very impressive. It's a Pokemon with a lot of ridges and little details, and they managed to make the sprite with all those details. All the Rotoms are very charming. All the starters look pretty polished, and all the evolutions look top-notch too. So what if Glaceon isn't that good? Look how cool that sprite is. Not everyone was super into the animated sprites when Black and White came out, and I can't blame them entirely. They weren't perfectly implemented. They could look a little more pixelated depending on what was happening, or just depending on the Pokemon. However, what makes it more mixed is probably less that for me, and more just how much the quality of the animations will depend on the Pokemon. Some clearly just look better than others. Zapdos, for example, is harmless, but kind of uninspired looking. But Hydreigon, on the other hand, moves great and just looks super badass. Crocodile is another that looks really natural and smooth in movement. Unfortunately, for every really good one, there is one that looks stiff or like awkward moving parts. What may not help for some people, a lot of these older sprites are pretty much just based on their previous Gen 4 sprites, just now with some animation added. This isn't a terrible thing. as the fact that they have a full standing animation is new enough on its own. Not to mention the back sprites being full body and also fully animated. This definitely had to take some time considering how large the roster was by this point, and it's pretty respectable that they did this for every Pokemon. I also have to admit that I think most of the best ones are the Gen 5 Pokemon themselves. The starters, Volcarona, Sock, even Vanillux. For some, if the designs on their own didn't sell them, maybe the animations may have. For previous gen Pokemon, Pidgeotto definitely stands out, and the Cyndaquil line finally gets to have its flames constantly moving and overall has less choppy movement than the other Johto starters. Politoed also has one of the cutest animations along with Pikachu. I also think Kabutops' animation is pretty good, despite being so short. It's kinda satisfying. Then there's all the Rotoms, there's Absol, and man, there's just too many Pokemon to talk about. I think I've made my point about the best sprites, however, and how each generation differs from each other and tries to improve from game to game. I do wish we had a sprite-based Pokemon game again. Yeah, we've got no shortage of fan work, but I love something official. Even if it's not a main core Pokemon game or a spin-off that plays like a core game or something. I don't know, I just like to see it. And those are my picks for some of the best sprites in each generation. Honestly, I could have named more, but we would have been here forever. Plus, this isn't the last time I'll talk about these sprites, because I may end up doing the worst sprites too. But what are your favorite sprites? Do you want to see a traditional Pokemon game use sprites again someday? What style of sprite would you want to see? Gen 2? 3? Do you want them to animate it all, like black and white? Or would you prefer completely static sprites? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below.